Good afternoon, everyone. I am Peter Carmichael, the director of the Civil War Institute at Gettysburg College. I'm also a member of the History Department, and I am with Dr. Ashley Luskey. She is the assistant director of the Civil War Institute, and we are here today to talk about Alfred Iversons attack on July the 1st. For many of you watching, you know that July the 1st was, I would say, a pretty clear-cut victory for R.E. Lee. But the day did not get off to a particularly good start for him. The early morning assaults at 9 o'clock, James Archer's brigade and Davis's brigade, just off to our right. And Cameron, if you don't mind, you can take the camera over there. And off in the distance, you can see the bridge that goes over the railroad cut. That's where Davis's brigade was manhandled. And then beyond that, you can see the woods, McPherson's woods. It's in that area where Archer's brigade was repulsed. Those two brigades, they are knocked back, but the fighting was renewed in the afternoon, and that's what Ashley and I, mostly Ashley, is going to talk about. The other two assaults, ONeill's brigade and Iverson's brigade. So we're going to go back and forth, and I should note that for those of you who are watching, you can in fact type in questions, even though this is taped. Ashley and I will be watching it live, and so we are happy to respond to you by, I guess, essentially like text. We'll type back our answers, and then maybe at the end we can turn on and talk to folks as well. So, Ashley, Iverson's brigade, Alfred Iverson, let's begin with him. In the Army of Northern Virginia, there are a lot of brigade commanders who are renowned for their aggressiveness, renowned for the fact that the brigade themselves was reliable, dependable in a battle. Iverson's brigade does not have that reputation. So can you tell us a little bit about Iverson and a little bit about the history of the brigade before they arrived here on July the 1st?
Sure. So Alfred Iverson's brigade goes down in history as one of probably the most politically charged, politically traumatized units, I would say, coming into Gettysburg, partially because of their commander's personal history and because of what they had been through prior to the battle itself in terms of battle experience. Iverson himself is a political general in every sense of the term. He comes from a family of great means, from Georgia, wealthy, slave-holding. His father was a U.S. congressman prior to the war. He himself has basically come to all of his military appointments before the Civil War because of his father's patronage and close connections to government officials.
But we should say at least his dad didn't get him out of the war.
He did not.
We gotta give him credit for that.
He did not. Right? Yes, that is true.
Was he a Mexican War veteran?
He was.
Yeah,
he was in the Mexican War for 1 year, but he was ravaged by disease, and so he went home in less than a year's time, and he spent the rest of the war sitting it out. So he had some experience, fighting in the war, at least being on the war, the front in the Mexican War. He had some experience fighting in the western frontier before the Civil War. He had some raids with the Comanches out west. He had spent some time in Kansas. He had also spent some time just up the road here in Carlisle recruiting for the wars on the western frontier. But aside from that, he hadn't really seen a lot of heavy military combat, and so his actual experience in the battlefield was very slim compared to a lot of the men in his command.
Well, it's interesting when we think about Lee's Army in Northern Virginia, we don't often think of political generals. In fact, we almost always think of that army as free of politics, in large part because Lee had such clout that he could go to Davis and could say, you know what, we need to move this man to where he could really be valuable in Trans-Mississippi, right? And so Iverson, political general, and I think that's fascinating about his background. Prior to Gettysburg, Chancellorsville, can you tell us a little bit about what happened to Iverson's brigade there? And I know that there is already some suspicion about Iverson in headquarters because of what had happened at Chancellorsville.
Yeah, and even if I could just back up
Sure.
before Chancellorsville, because the history of the unit really has to go back to what happened at South Mountain in September of 1862. At that time, the brigade was under the command of a North Carolinian. It's an all-North Carolina brigade. This is very important to these men to be, surrounded by comrades and officers from their state. Their commander, Samuel Garland, was killed at South Mountain, and this was a devastating blow for the men of the brigade. Garland was beloved, he was trusted, he was a good leader, and at South Mountain, after Garland is killed, the brigade basically breaks and runs. there's a lot of suspicion, some wary eyes about why that happened, about the courage of these men. And then the men from there move on to Antietam, where in a confrontation in the East Woods, they again break and run. And so kind of the tensions are mounting, the suspicions are mounting about how good are these men. There's a lot of political infighting going on now that they've lost their top commander. And it's in November of 1864 that Alfred Iverson comes to take command. I'm sorry, 1862 comes to take command of the brigade.
Right.
And it's really then that the big problems begin. There's issues with morale, there's issues with desertion, all of that.
He's an outsider.
He's an outsider, yeah.
He's a
Georgian,
Georgian, right,
and he comes in, he tries to take out a bunch of the North Carolina appointed officers. He replaces them with his personal friends, many of whom don't have the combat experience. And so there are a lot of questions about his very heavy disciplinarian's hand. He believes very much in a hierarchy, a divided line between enlisted men and the officers. And he inflicts some harsh punishments on these guys, some of which they seem to compare to being treated like slaves in terms of the physical punishments. And so this is an affront to these guys' honor. So then fast forward through the winter of 1862 into 63, there is more desertion, morale is pretty low. The disciplinarian in Iverson really comes out. His men tried to stage a coup actually against him in December of 1862, where they try to basically defeat some of Iverson's new appointments for junior officers, and he has to arrest 26 of those men. So the tensions are mounting, and then we get into Chancellorsville, where both on May 2nd and May 3rd, Iverson's men are in the thickest of the fray. They're part of Jackson's flank march. They're back on May 3rd, and Iverson is nowhere to be found. He sends his men seemingly into the woods, surrounded by gun smoke. They're lost, they're confused, they get absolutely mauled at Chancellorsville, and no one can find Alfred Iverson. And so people begin to wonder.
But it's the wilderness. Let's give the guy a break here. Everyone's getting lost in the wilderness. Come on, right? Here, he should be fine. Here, it's an open field.
You would think.
You would think.
You would
right,
think.
You would think.
You would think, yes.
Right.
But, by the time the men arrive here in Gettysburg that July, they've been through battle after battle where their commanders have not led them well, where they've been wondering where exactly is Alfred Iverson. He's busy, he's heavy on the discipline, but he's pretty light on the leadership.
I think there's still a book to be done on the political generals in the Army in Northern Virginia. Not that we don't have. There's a good book on Iverson. I've not read, but I think you have endorsed it. It's published by Savas, was it not? I believe it was.
It might be.
I should have done my homework. By the time this is aired, we'll look up that book.
Sure.
I've heard very good things about it.
Yes.
But there's just so many others that we don't have a full story on. And again, the persistence to 1863 is still sort of shocking to me.
Right.
I mean, we know others that have been dispensed with. I mean, Toombs is dispensed with, but hell, he got wounded at Antietam, so that made that pretty easy. And there are others as well.
Right.
Before we go to our next stop, we should probably talk a little bit about the setting on July 1st. I'd already mentioned the early morning attacks, Archer and Davis's brigade, they're repulsed. The fighting from that started to lead Ewell's Corps from the north, which would be to my right, heading toward us. And Gab, why don't you keep the camera right there, Cameron? And we'll let Ashley talk about the arrival of Rhodes' division, Robert Rhodes, coming over Oak Hill, which we have the eternal peace flame directly in front of us. And Ashley, if I don't say this now, I'll forget it. How do you like that? So Ashley's going to give us the description, and I just keep talking. What is, I think, striking about this place where we're standing, and an assault that Ashley will describe for us that resulted in such heavy casualties. Not only is there not a Confederate monument out here, which that's maybe not too much of a surprise, there's not a single interpretive marker that describes Iversons Assault, except for one, but it's up by the Eternal Peace Line, and it really is probably more confusing than anything else. Now, I know that there are a lot of new interpretive markers that will be coming to the battlefield, Park Service put together. Let's hope that there is something here, because for those people who come to this spot, it is the Eternal Peace Line, which is important in its own right, and a bunch of Union monuments. And if you didn't know a first thing about Gettysburg, you'd think, oh, Buford's men fought here, and then that's basically it.
Right.
So Ashley, could you talk about the arrival of Rhodes' division coming over Oak Hill?
Sure. So about noon on July 1st, Robert Rhodes arrives on what is now known as Oak Hill. He basically takes takes a look out at this landscape, and he sees the right flank of the Union Army just kind of hanging in the air, seemingly. Basically, the right flank is back. Cameron, if you want to pan across the field here, you see the tower, you see the wood line, and the Doubleday Inn, which is now a modern hotel. But that is where the right flank of the Union line really sat on the afternoon of July 1st. And so he thought he had a grand opportunity to come in with his division and smash that right flank over in what is known as Sheets' Woods. And so when he arrives, he describes the scene as just a grand spectacle. He had never seen basically landscape that was so ripe and ready for the taking. And so he hurries his men, his brigades along. They pull off into the wood line. Actually, they're sheltered for a good mile or so, approaching Oak Hill. So he thinks, I have the perfect opportunity to spring this trap and really, smash the Union's right flank. But Robert Rhodes does something kind of uncharacteristic to him. He panics. He misreads the movement of Union troops that he begins to see arriving. He begins to see the arrival of the 11th Corps, Union 11th Corps, coming in through the town of Gettysburg. He begins to see some reinforcements from John Robinson's division to the right of the Union line here. Those reinforcements are actually just a skirmish line, but he thinks that the Union troops have spotted his men and that they are going out to attack him. He also thinks that the Union 11th Corps is coming through town to try and come in and hit his flank. And so he hurriedly gets his men into position, and he gives a series of kind of chaotic orders to his brigade commanders. Again, not in the true style of Robert Rhodes, who was a pretty distinguished commander by this point in the war. And it's there that the real issues start to unravel between Alfred Iverson and particularly between him and another commander of an Alabama brigade just to his left, commanded by Edward ONeill. But it's Rhodes's plan that he can spread out his division, his line of men, basically arcing from just to the right of the peace light, all the way turning to the left, back through that wood line, and extending. You can keep turning to the left, all the way behind Park Road. And then he wants to deploy his men into position, and when he gives the green light for the assault, that there will be a massive coordinated assault attacking along this basically half-mile or so front of his division, attacking against these Union troops. But again, he knows that it's basically, or he thinks that it's basically, a race to the front. Who can make it first? His troops smashing the Union right flank, or the Union reinforcements sneaking upwards.
So we're talking total, really 3 brigades. ONeill, right? Iverson, and then Daniel. Right?
Daniel, and then Ramsher.
Ramsher ultimately will be, right? But the first 3, they are pushed out.
Correct.
So I think we should head to our next stop, and we'll talk about the Union dispositions as well. Also talk about the terrain and how it's changed and not changed since the battle. And just the last thing about Rhodes, which I think you're spot on, certainly among the divisional commanders in the Army of Northern Virginia. I mean, Rhodes is right there, Hood, A.P. Hill, even Ewell, as divisional commanders. They certainly were all more than just reliable for R.E. Lee, but not here for Robert Rhodes. I mean, this is the first of many miscues or disappearances on Rhodes' part. It is unfortunate that, to my knowledge, no one has ever uncovered a cache of letters from Rhodes, any personal letters. He is kind of a mystery man. And that, again, like I said, it's too bad, because he played such a pivotal role in so many battles as well. All right, we'll go off to our next stop. Okay, we're at our stop number 2 on Oak Ridge, in the middle of what would have been Robinson's Federal Division on July the 1st. Ashley's going to talk about the disposition of those units, but it's important to note that the landscape in front of us and around us, some of it looks a lot like it did in 1863. Some of it has changed forever and does not resemble its wartime appearance. In fact, where the Federals were positioned, Robinson's division, that has changed a great deal. So Ashley's going to talk a little bit about those changes, and she'll talk a little bit about Robinson's division before we then turn our attention back toward the Confederate attack.
So what you're looking at across the field here is the field across which Iverson's men would ultimately make their assault. Back in 1863, this was a field of planted timothy hay, so it was fairly low, fairly open. There was only one fence line bisecting it that was running kind of parallel to the Mummersburg Road, which is just off to the right here. So fairly open. There have been some changes to the gradation of the land due to an early 20th century airport that was installed here for actually aerial tours of the battlefield that operated for maybe 20 years or so. But that's kind of the major change to the land, aside from the fact that the Forney farm, which used to stand at the intersection where we just were, where Iverson's men stepped off, is no longer there.
Do you know when that came down, the Forney farm?
It was, I want to say it's mid to late 1900s. It was around for a while because there are some pictures of it with the descendants of the Forneys in the park files.
So actually also the fields in front of us, and I'd already forgotten, but you had said to me a few weeks ago that this was a landing strip for planes. You know, when we were standing at the jump off point for Iverson's brigade, and I took this field in, and again, this is why I'd encourage those of you who are watching to actually come out here and walk the land, because it appears that for at least part of the way there was some cover afforded to Iverson's men. I mean, here it looks completely wide open and exposed the entire time, but do you have any sense at all was there some coverage until they got relatively close?
Yeah, and in fact there's a kind of a gully that runs about halfway through the field, just beyond that knoll that you see off to the left by the fence line. There is a gully that would have hidden the men, not that they needed it necessarily in terms of protection from bullets, because they weren't fired on until they got a lot closer to the Federal line. But yes, they would have gone kind of up and down a couple of gullies and ravines before they ultimately approached the Federal line.
Right. And so the point is that from that jump off point where you see the Union monuments to Buford's cavalry regiments, and we see a few cars going along as well. From that jump off point, they don't immediately come under fire.
Correct.
Right? And do they receive any artillery fire?
Not this part of the line. Another part of the Confederate attack led by Edward ONeill, the Alabama Brigade, that's going on off to my left here, over on Iverson's left flank. They get hit by artillery from a couple of sides, actually, down from in the valley there next to what is now the college fields, off to their left. Yeah. But in terms of the difference in landscape that Pete was talking about for the Federals, it is dramatically different, I would say, in some regards. And Cameron, if you want to pan the camera over to your left toward the stone wall. So Robinson's men would have been lined up behind a stone wall, which this stone wall is not the original one. It's been moved a couple of times by a farmer in order to accommodate a farmer's lane. It probably would have been higher. We're not exactly sure the location of where it would have been. We think probably there's been some changes to the gradation of the road bed here that would have made the Federals a little bit more elevated than what you would think today. But the Federals would have had the protection of the stone wall, and they would have been just kind of off the crest of what we now know as Oak Ridge. And basically they were lying in wait for Iverson's men and for Edward ONeill's brigade on the afternoon of the 1st. And because they had that good protection, Iverson's men had no idea that they were there. They were convinced that the Federal right flank is still hid in the tree line in Sheets' Woods, which we talked about at the first stop. And they were taken by complete surprise. And the Federals were shocked, quite frankly, that the Confederates were advancing so brazenly, so closely to their line when they were just lying in wait for them.
Sure. So actually, just to help our folks here, and then Cameron, if you could then go back to your left. So ONeill's attack is going to come toward us. The fields for Gettysburg College, you can see off to your right front. And so here's again, I've always struggled in visualizing this. Are you suggesting that Robinson's men, they were able to repulse ONeill's attack, and then they turned, the very same men, to turn and face Iversons Assault, right?
Correct. And so ONeill's men, they actually advanced from the side of Oak Hill, and they're supposed to be attacking along the eastern slope of Oak Ridge here and along basically the spine of Oak Ridge. But ONeill is also a political commander. He is not the best leader by any means. And he does not coordinate his attack with Iverson. Iverson does not coordinate his attack with ONeill. And again, Rhodes' orders are very confusing. So O'Neill's men set off from Oak Hill. Again, they're supposed to be attacking basically, perpendicular to where the road lies, and they begin to drift downward, down the slope here. And so those Federals who are lying, hidden, concealed behind the stone wall and some orchards that would have been here at the time, they just turn and quickly, in about 15 to 20 minutes, just maul O'Neill's brigade. And in 15 or 20 minutes, that part of the assault is over, and O'Neill's men can no longer be of any help to Iverson at that time.
Yeah, I just quickly say here, is it conceptually, this is still a very good plan. I mean, I understand, as you pointed out, that Rhodes acted, he was impetuous, maybe panicked a little bit, maybe his orders were not very clear, but it goes back to a fundamental question that we always ask on Civil War battlefields, and that is, how do brigades bring the degree of coordination that we think they should have brought when we look at them? And it seems, of course, so easy on the map. Yeah, hey, just connect these two little lines, right. Iverson and ONeill, bring them together, and if that were to have happened, I mean, it truly would have been a disaster for the Federals. I think it also points actually to the fact of how much we don't know and will never know, meaning the oral instructions that were given. What did Rhodes actually say to these men? I mean, he said there's some contradictory orders, but and so much of that is imperfect in terms of our knowledge here. And I guess, Lee must have thought, and now I'm conjecture here, is that Lee must have thought, well, Rhodes can make up for these political generals, right? He's such a good divisional commander. He can somehow, bring these men and get the very best out of them. But again, this is just a classic example that we see on Civil War battlefields all the time. Cameron, why don't we move a little bit over here and we'll let Ashley continue. We have some foot traffic that we're having to compete with here.
So one of the interesting things about O'Neill's and Iverson's communication, what was supposed to happen, they were told to basically work in concert with each other to attack, so that Iverson would be attacking in our direction at the same time that O'Neill's men would be closing in directly on the flank of the Federal line. Of course, O'Neill is annihilated. He's completely stopped before Iverson even gets started. Iverson looks to his left, and all of a sudden O'Neill is nowhere to be found. And that's when he gives the orders to his men to start advancing across the field.
And I'll just add again, I think you and I talked about this a few weeks ago. I mean, if you go on the other side of this ridgeline, that's a different universe over there.
Right.
I mean, to bring this degree of coordination, it's difficult enough in terrain that would cooperate, but this ridgeline, Oak Ridge, it actually blocks line of sight. Now, that doesn't mean it's impossible for these two officers to not have some degree of communication, but again, I mean, it is remarkable when I hear people look at a map and they play armchair general, right, and they expect these things to occur, that the degree of difficulty is pretty high.
And I think one of the things that Iverson gets potentially rightly slammed for is that he doesn't send out his skirmish line. He has skirmishers that are down in the valley by the McLean farm, so all the way down the slope, but he doesn't have skirmishers here. And so he really has no idea where the Federal line lies. He just goes in, all of his men all at one time, and same with O'Neill. O'Neill has a few skirmishers here and there, but not that set skirmish line that would have tested the waters a bit before opening an all-out assault.
Iverson seems to be disinterested in where his men are and where they're going. Right?
It seems to be that way, yeah. Yes.
That's good. So do you want to go to the next stop and we can talk in more detail about Iverson's actual attack?
Sure.
Okay.
Sounds good.
That's good.
So we are standing here on our third stop of the tour. This is basically the point at which Iverson's brigade started taking the first shots, and in fact, this is where they get bogged down and where the assault never basically gets renewed once the men begin to hit the ground. Those men have marched across. There are 4 regiments that are marching across this field. They're supposed to be marching kind of parallel to where we are, again, thinking they're going to be hooking up with O'Neill's brigade. To their left, O'Neill's brigade, of course, does not join them. And in the confusion, the Confederate commanders, the junior officers, begin to wonder, where are our reinforcements? And so the line begins to shift from going like this to going like this. And so at this point in the line, we have basically 1 regiment, the 5th North Carolina, on Iverson's left flank, is turned almost perpendicular to the stone wall where the Federals are waiting for them. So an incredibly basically saying that this was just like shooting fish at barrel. It was so easy. They were shocked that the Confederates had made such a huge mistake. And these men, the Tar Heels, are just knocked down, some of them in complete battle formation, head to toe, lining a straight line. They're just slaughtered. So these volleys are destructive. The commanders realize they don't have anyone to lead them out of this mess that they're in. They don't know where their reinforcements are going to come from. And so they tell their men to hit the ground. They are somewhat protected by this small ravine just behind us. I know it probably doesn't look like much on camera. It doesn't seem like much even standing here. But to a Civil War soldier, any dip of ground is, of course, going to be helpful.
Yeah.
And so those men hit the ground and they try to take advantage of any of the protection.
Well, if they're
that they
flat
can.
on the ground, it would be very difficult for the Federals.
It would.
I think we should get camera. Give me the camera. Let's get down there. Tell us what you can see. These students, they don't have any sense of adventure, do they? Just none.
He doesn't want to get his pants on.
He doesn't want to get his pants. Yes. And his little leather side. You always don't wear battlefield shoes, man. Let the people see your shoes. You don't wear shoes like that on the battlefield. You always got to be fashionable, don't you? Always have to. It's all right. Hey, why don't you, man, turn around and show them the Federal line here? And again, as Ashley pointed out before, the stone wall. So we're not sure if that's the exact position, or maybe it is.
I'm not sure what the exact position is. We know that it wasn't on this side of the road as far as everything that I've read, that it has been moved back. But the Federals would have had to have been a little bit higher to, number one, see the Confederates, and number two, to begin leveling those.
I mean, that's where it's so confusing for the folks who come out here, and these are the kinds of things that I think about way too much, is that the Federals would have to be on the military crest, I would think. If they're on the crest where we're standing out, Cameron, you can bring it back around if you don't mind. So where we are, and I would say roughly, what, almost 100 yards?
Yeah, 80 to 100.
80 to 100 yards, right? But again, the kind of cover that Ashley's just described in this little swale or ravine certainly would have afforded a great deal of protection, but it must have been that initial volley.
Sure. And I should mention too that it's not only this swale that provides some protection. There is one regiment on the brigade's right flank, the 12th North Carolina, that actually seeks refuge. It starts to back up a little bit when it receives its first volleys, and it backs up behind that knoll, which, Cameron, I don't know if you can kind of zoom in on the knoll that rises. You see the fence line kind of climbing the hill over there. The 12th North Carolina hits the ground behind there. They know that they're receiving fire not only from directly in front of them, but from Lysander Cutler's brigade, which is in Sheeds's woods. And so they're going to be receiving fire from both sides, and they realize this is just an untenable position. And so they do try to seek some personal cover over there, and because of that, they escape with relatively few losses, 23% casualties, I believe, as compared to some of the other units.
You don't hear Lysander as a name these days, do you?
Don't.
That's
It's
kind
unfortunate.
of it's past, right?
Right.
It's done.
Right.
It's too bad. It is unfortunate. So we are roughly then on the left.
Yes.
We're at the left end.
Yes, the left
brigade as
end
well.
of the brigade. This is where the 5th North Carolina, again, would have been almost parallel to the stone wall where the Federals would have been firing from. So they get a direct fire into their flank. But it's even worse, actually, for the guys who are closer to Sheeds's woods, often kind of that triangular corner of the field over there. That's where the 20th North Carolina, actually that was Iverson's original home unit, the one that he helped recruit down in Wilmington, North Carolina, as well as the 23rd North Carolina. They are getting direct, close fire from Cutler's men in the wood line, as well as from men from Baxter's and then Hall's brigade, who are firing directly at them. And so that crossfire is what really destroys those two units for the 20th.
And you would say, and Cameron, I'm sure you could get this, that area where they got basically a converging fire, right? It looks like there's a big track line. Is that kind of that area, that killing ground there?
Yeah.
Again, who knows how much of this has been disturbed, right? But that's interesting. The converging fire is what was so damaging. There is a wonderful set of letters from a Federal soldier, Rush Caddy, and somehow in the confusion, he and some of his comrades, they decided to go across the stone wall. They got somewhere out in this area. And Caddy was hit serious wound, and the men took him behind the lines, carried him to a house in Gettysburg. He lingered lingered for a few weeks, enough time for his mother to come all the way down from New York, and then she wrote a letter to her husband, Rush's father. It's a powerful, it's a poignant letter. Rush was fading in and out of consciousness, and there were moments in which he was able to express his willingness to die, that he had resigned himself as a Christian, and that he had in fact given his life for a good cause. But the mother's letters, the anguish that she felt, but in the end, the sense of pride that her son had fought and died for the Union cause. It is a very unusual letter that you get from a parent who's by the deathbed of a son, that Drew Gilpin Faust, the good death, which these men certainly did not have. Rush Caddy did. But they were so interested, the family was, in Rush Caddy's last moments and what happened here on this field, that they wrote some of Caddy's other soldiers that were in his command. And so it's really pretty remarkable. It always surprises me, then it never does surprise me, that something so small on this field, there's just such an abundance of information.
Sure. Yeah, and that's an interesting juxtaposition too with the good death, that there are so many of these men, these North Carolinians, who are basically, ankle deep in mud, in streams of blood, literally, unable to get up, unable to retreat, unable to move forward, and they are just wondering, are we just gonna be left here to die? Do we surrender? Do we risk another, embarrassing defeat, another moment of dishonor on the battlefield after what's come before, at South Mountain, Antietam, Chancellorsville? Or do we try to retreat? They just don't see a way out of it. And so for a lot of them, I think this is a moment where they feel abandoned, for sure, emasculated. In the aftermath, you get letters back and forth between some of the comrades who survive and the families, the mothers and the sisters of the comrades who did not. And they're trying to make sense of this, trying to recount for the families how exactly this person died. But it's a hard thing to do when you're talking about someone basically groveling in mud. It's not the good death at all, when you're basically, living your last moments like an animal, rolling around in mud and blood. And they struggle with that in the wake of what happens here.
Well, and then as a little preview to the Civil War Institute, this summer Ashley's going to take another group out here, and she will then be taking the group to one of the field hospitals where Iversons wounded and mortally wounded, where they were taken. It's about, what did you say, as a crow flies, not even a mile, maybe a mile?
Yeah.
The barn, the original barn is still there. The well that was used by Iverson's men is there as well. There's two other accounts that I'm thinking of. I believe it's Henry Berkeley, who was in Hanover Artillery. His diary was published by Virginia Historical Society. It's a good diary. It's got some details in it. He came upon this scene on the evening, I believe, of July the 1st or early morning July 2nd, and he mentioned exactly what you said. He saw a line of North Carolinians. He said that he thought they were lined up for burial, but in fact, as you pointed out, they fell down, it appears, after one great volley from the Federals. He was so disgusted by it all. He had his breakfast in his hand, so this must have been the morning of the 2nd. He said that he had to put his biscuit back into his haversack, that he could not eat it. And then there's another Confederate account from, I believe his first name was William Robbins. He was on the Battlefield Commission. He's a North Carolinian in Lee's army. And he kept a diary. It's not particularly detailed, but it's just interesting as hell, because he would write about the men, the veterans who came and visited the battlefield. He talked about some men coming to this area, and that they recounted a story in which some of these North Carolinians were trying to surrender, and either in the confusion or maybe the Federals just didn't want to stop shooting at them. He said that despite the white handkerchiefs that they were waving in the air, that the Federals kept gunning them down. Now, there's some friendly fire that might have been part of this as well, but just for a moment, I'd like for you, Cameron, to get the Eternal Peace light there. As we all know, 1938, FDR came, and 1963, we also have, during the commemorative centennial of Gettysburg, we have a host of dignitaries there as well. And from 38 and even in 1963, the message is, as the message is today, that this is a land that we need to remember for American heroism, that these Northerners and Southerners, that they kind of had their differences, but at the end of the day, what we need to remind ourselves former enemies, they were able to reconcile. And that's undoubtedly true. That happened after the war. But just again, that this monument and the fact that there's not a single wayside that describes Iverson's brigade here. We lose sight that the Confederates were even here, and we lose sight of that incident, and there are probably many others that Robbins described of Confederate soldiers being shot down by the Federals. Now look, I'm not saying this is an act of war that should be equated with murder. It's certainly not an atrocity. It happened. It's a civil war. But this landscape today does everything it can to push those kinds of incidents away from our imagination of this place. And I think Lieutenant Ashton did such a nice job of describing what this area would have looked like after those initial volleys by the Federals. I'd say keep looking. Go all the way back to the ridgeline, all the way where our first stop was. And imagine all the walking wounded. Imagine those men, for whatever reason, they could not continue the assault. Some might call them cowards, but they fled. And I'd also imagine that there were probably quite a number of enslaved people back there. Enslaved people whose owner was an officer, right? Enslaved people that might have been helping with the wounded as well. And so when you look behind the battle line after a fight, you start to begin, as I think Ashley pointed to, you have other stories and other people that are lost, right? And this commemorative landscape that we have, those stories, they disappear. But they won't in June when Ashley gets her tour here.
That's right.
For CWI.
Well, another thing to point out too, Pete, is that in addition to the savagery that gets lost here, we lose sight of the numerous other interior battles that occur within this brigade and within the minds of these men as they walk off the battlefield. This has been, because of the horror that happens here for these men, 900 out of 1,400 will not return to the ranks after this assault. So it's a pretty steep casualty count. These men have been trapped in this ravine. They've had no one to rescue them. They've tried to surrender. There's been a countercharge by Federals who will come out here and round up a bunch as prisoners of war. As they're being rounded up out of this ravine, to add insult to injury, in the fog of war, the chaos of war, ONeill's brigade begins to rally up again on Oak Hill and will try to pour a volley into the Federals' right flank to try and help them out, but they'll end up hitting more of their own men. So it just seems like these guys are being assaulted from all sides. And after the smoke clears, Alfred Iverson will write in his official report that when he looked across the field, of course he's nowhere to be found, he's back in the tree line across the way, he writes that he saw a bunch of men would look like putting white pieces of handkerchiefs and such up on their boots, up on tips of swords, trying to surrender. And he thought the first thing that came to his mind was, what an act of cowardice, what an act of dishonor. And he quickly corrects himself, and he says that when I realized that they had been shot down and that they weren't merely surrendering, I quickly exonerated the men. But in the wake of this, he praises all of his political appointees,
right.
instead of the people who are the real heroes on the field. And so these men walk away from here deeply troubled. It's not only because of the savagery that they've encountered here, it's because they feel completely alienated and alone, separated from these commanders who are supposed to guide them into battle and stand up for them. And they have to face horrible reports in the Carolina newspapers about soldiers surrendering for no reason, episodes of cowardice. There are numerous fingers being pointed. The blame game starts.
And not to mention the Richmond papers.
The Richmond papers,
which are basically the national paper, right?
They're all
dismissive of the North Carolinians,
right?
As well.
And so these men have to write home simultaneously, as I said, trying to reckon with the awful episodes of death that they've seen and relay those episodes to family members. But they also have to exonerate themselves, defend themselves against something that they didn't think that they'd have to, and that in their minds, if Iverson had come to their defense, if they had some better junior officers to work with, this wouldn't have happened. And so they're very happy to see Iverson be formally relieved of this command in July of 1863. But again, when we look at this field, I think we often think of a united Confederate front.
That's right.
But here in the lines, these were not soldiers part of a monolithic brigade. There were deep fractures and fissures that these men will carry on with them long after the war.
Yeah, that's a really excellent and important point, right? Because we want to say, oh, band of brothers, and to a degree that's true, but you're right, there are all these factions and fractured relationships as well. I should know this, but I don't. Who did Lee inflict Iverson on after this? He's relieved, and then does he go to Georgia? something?
Eventually, he's placed in temporary command of Nichols's Louisiana Brigade, and then he's
So he
relieved
stays
of
with
that
the A&B for a little bit.
for a little bit, and then he is finally sent to Georgia to be in charge of the Home Guard unit, and then he is eventually dispatched to join Wheeler's cavalry, and so he is with the cavalry throughout much of the final days of the Atlanta campaign, and he basically will never recover from the insult of being dismissed.
Does he have a
in such
political
way.
career in Reconstruction? I don't think
No.
he does. Right?
He doesn't. No, I mean his fortunes after the war are pretty sorry, to say the least.
And his dad couldn't rescue him then.
His dad couldn't rescue him. He tries his hand at farming oranges, and he is a victim to numerous freezes. So he's a failed orange farmer who dies living at his daughter's house, in fact, in Florida. So it's not a glorious end for Iverson. Iverson himself is a poet at heart. He wrote numerous poems during the war about losing his first wife, but then also about the lost cause, essentially,
Really?
and how he just, he couldn't let go.
And they've
What
survived?
happened.
Some of them have?
At least there are quotes that I've read. I don't know if the full things are there, but I've seen them.
I mean, usually bad poetry survives, right?
Right.
Like the great letters, they somehow disappear and get burned in the fire, but
Right.
the bad poetry always lives on.
Well, it must be there.
It must be there. It
around
has,
in
it has
full.
to be there. It has to be there. Ashley, this was excellent. And again, this summer at CWI, Ashley will be leading a group out here. Maybe I'll tag along. I haven't signed up for my group yet.
Oh, that's.
Because I'm not doing any of. So this year the theme is from a battlefield, right, to a field hospital, and each regiment that folks will be following, they'll obviously do something on the field, and then they'll go to the barn, and then talk about the experience of the survivors there. So again, Ashley, it was outstanding. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us. Our next episode is
With Gary Gallagher.
Gary Gallagher. How about that? How nice of him to, well, you know what? He kept sending us emails begging to be on the show, and I thought, hell, that's the least I could do for this guy, you know? He only got me through for my dissertation. We'll be gentle on him, right? He's sensitive. He's a sensitive man. All right, you all. Take care. Thank you, Cameron, right? You're looking good, man. Let's get another look at those shoes one more time, please. They're just very nice. Well done.
And remember to send in your comments.
Send in your
so that
comments
we
and
can,
questions. That's right.
respond to
If you want to know where Karen bought his shoes, I'm sure he'll tell you. Take care, y'all. Have a
Thank
nice
you.
evening.